In any relationship, you can predict if a divorce or breakup will happen with 90% accuracy. And it's not things like fighting either, because as it turns out, it's more about your communication style than anything else. This is from the research of renowned psychologist and professor John Gottman, whose work is considered best for identifying and preventing the core reasons why breakups happen. But before we go over it to see if it applies to you, here is a very intriguing piece of data that I stumbled upon after going through his studies the last couple days. So 69% of happy couples still have the very same unresolved conflicts after 10 years. So a decade passes and most couples, the actual successful ones, the happy ones, are still fighting about the same things. That is wild. I get there will always be some differences or headbutting, like if one is more introverted or tidy or frugal or whatever. But is there no way to structure relationships differently? Or at least have some level of acceptance of the differences? Now, I wouldn't go as far as Harry Brown's advice, who says if one person happens to be a slob, you should split the household and he should be allowed to be so in half of the rooms. But I do still think an ideal arrangement is one that doesn't involve a lot of compromise. But anyway, let's get back to the science of a breakup. So first, John had a bunch of different interviews with different couples, measuring their facial expressions, their body language, heart rate, skin temperature. They had their own self-assessment. Basically, they just saw how they reacted when they talked about the relationship. They then used all that data to create this breakup model with 90% accuracy. And John says it really just comes down to 4 different things: criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, which is just refusing to communicate, and contempt. Now, criticism is kind of obvious and common, so I wouldn't say that's really that telling. And contempt is like they're beneath you. There could be mocking or insult, so I think it's too late at that point. But defensiveness and stonewalling are the standouts to me. So if you're in a relationship right now and one person is just never at fault, they never take the blame, or on the other hand, if they just shut down and just anytime a discussion just heats up, they just go defensive mode, then you might want to work on that, especially if there's also contempt and criticism. Now, what about that communication style that I brought up earlier? Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting. If you're very vocal and expressive with your emotions and anger, that can actually be okay if your partner is as well. And the same thing if you're both kind of reserved and don't really communicate to a very high level or don't let your emotions out. The worst thing is if you are mismatched, if you're both the different types, and that is what apparently leads to those 4 breakup signs. Now, the final indication of a breakup that he found is if positive to negative interactions aren't at least 5-1. Certainly negative ones are just like anger and stuff, but I looked up what he lists for positive. If you're curious, compliments, affection, thanking them, active listening, laughing, and just enjoying things together. But hopefully if you are dating someone, you now at least have some things that you can look out for. But before I go, I'm going to leave you with a few things. So while I don't agree with Harry Brown's advice of splitting the house in 2 for one person to be a slob, I do agree with his overall message regarding relationships. So he says, limit the relationship to what you have in common. Don't expect more from it than what is in the self-interest of each person involved. When you extend the relationship beyond the areas of mutual self-interest, someone will have to sacrifice. To me, that's completely spot on. Secondly, speaking from my own experience, you should make it a priority to never get comfortable. This is part not taking them for granted, but also not letting your body or your drive go. They'll appreciate it. It'll put pressure on them to do the same. And if a breakup were to occur, you don't have to correct yourself back to where your ass should have been. Next, if you're young or even older and you get dumped, it's so easy to assume something is your fault, especially when you know there are things that you could have done differently. But I promise you, your mind is just a mess in that state. Learn from it and move on. You'll come to see things clearly as time passes. And finally, perhaps a hot take, but I don't think unconditional love should exist. Certainly things are complicated. You might want to retain a history together, but at what cost? You should only ever do what's in your best interest, so it just comes down to finding out exactly what that is. But anyway, see you next week.